What's going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite 69th ranked Marvel Snapper, here to talk to you about the best decks in Marvel Snap. Now, first up today, the best deck in the game, Cerebro 5. This deck has come out of nowhere. Who am I kidding? Let's be real. This is the best deck in the game. It was, it still is. Loki is the number one, but I will say that I think the top has become a little bit more evenly distributed. And it has become evenly distributed between two major camps and then two minor camps. So that's how we're going to structure this video. First camp is the Bounce shell. I've talked about that in previous videos, but you should be pretty aware of what it is. Sort of Falcon, Werewolf, one-drop type shell. You can see that at play in the Loki list, as well as in some Darkhawk decks as well. The second camp is the Zabu and Miss Marvel shell. That overlaps with Darkhawk, but they are not very much the same lists all the time. Now, the third camp, and again, these are two smaller islands off of here, that is going to be Destroy, and of course, there is still Lockdown out there. Those are the major things that you're going to want to keep an eye on. As far as Loki goes, I do believe it remains the best deck in the game. It is a consistent performer, even with a huge target on its back, and it has become a very reasonable metagame threat. Now, I do think that people need to understand this as a true hybrid deck, which is to say, this is a deck that is a hybrid between the Bounce stuff and the Loki stuff, and sometimes you end up with very awkward hands. You end up with, say, a Falcon that you don't want to play because you played a Quinjet on turn one, which, by the way, is why you should be prioritizing Misty Knight on turn one a lot more than most people do, because she's actually a good card to bounce back to your hand with a Falcon later. You might be in situations where you have a Shang-Chi in your hand, and you're like, oh man, I really wish I could play the Shang-Chi, but I have to Loki now, and that's a bad situation to be in as well. You might be in a situation where you replaced your Shang-Chi with a Rogue, and you end up playing a game where you're like, damn, I really wish I had that Shang-Chi again. That happened to me. Like, the deck's not perfect. I think that's really what I'm trying to say. This is not a perfect, world-beating deck that always feels good to play, that can't ever lose. It's just very, very, very good. And I think that is enough to make it the current best deck in the game, but I do think it is clear that this deck has weaknesses that can be exploited. Shadow King is a great way to exploit those weaknesses because of the way it relies on Werewolf and Collector, but I think for the most part, this remains the strongest deck in Marvel Snap. It would be my first choice in basically every scenario. Also in the Bounce camp is the Darkhawk Bounce list that some have been calling the best deck in the game, and I will say, I think if any deck is going to be the best deck in the game that you're not going to count Loki, I think this very well would be my first choice. It is an extremely powerful and dangerous list with a ton of ways to restrict your opponent's play patterns and limit what they can do. One of the downsides of it, though, is you need to be very confident in playing that disruption and saying, look, I know because of the disruption that I've played, maybe I Korged you, maybe I Black Widowed you twice, that I'm not going to sit here and worry about your best case scenario. I'm going to play to beat your middle case scenario. And if you have your best case scenario, okay, you got me. And the downside of that is it does give up a pretty decent amount of agency to your opponent, because a lot of the time the correct play with a deck like this is say, look, I've restricted their options so much that I'm going to stay in here, and if they have the perfect thing, they have the perfect thing. But on your opponent's side, they know if they have the perfect thing, and if they do, they're obviously staying. So that dynamic does sort of, I wouldn't say necessarily balance this deck out, because I do think it is an extremely strong deck, but it does require you to gauge those situations appropriately, and therefore I consider this a very skill-testing deck if you want to get a lot of cube rate out of it. As a note, if you want to replace Bast with something like Iceman, I think that is 100% okay. I know people are often looking for replacements for stuff. Iceman's very good right now, but it has the same issue as the rest of the deck, which is your opponent has the information and you don't have the information, so you have to sort of guess how effective your disruption has been. For that reason, I think there's already enough of that kind of stuff in the deck. I have included the Bast instead, because at least that way I know what I'm getting out of it, but, you know, your mileage may vary. Now that not a lot of people are playing Annihilus anymore, I think it might actually be the right time to take this out for a spin again. This is one of my favorite builds in this package, sort of wolf bounce package. I'm a big fan of this one. I really, really like it. So I wanted to put it on here to show exactly how customizable these bounce decks can get. there are a lot of options that you have for those last few cards. There's like maybe 9 cards that are basically set, and you can see those flipping through the 2 decks that we've looked at previously, the Darkhawk one and this one. There are maybe 9 cards that are basically set, and then you can sort of customize around those 9 cards a very powerful shell and a very powerful deck. Moving on to island number 2, and this is the Darkhawk Miss Marvel list. This is what I would consider sort of the default list, but yeah, a lot of these lists, there's just so much room for messing around with those final 3 cards. You could include cards like Alioth, you could include cards like Mobius and Mobius, you could include the ones we have here. We have a Shang-Chi, that's actually like, I know it sounds weird, but like Shang-Chi's actually kind of a flex slot now. You don't actually always need him. It's a very weird metagame right now. There's a lot of variation in how these decks match up against each other, different people teching for different things. And because there are different people teching for different things, the matchup between these types of decks is often dependent on those final 3 cards that you choose. For example, if you're playing a list like this, and you run up against a list that is playing absolutely no tech, playing things like Mystique to go alongside the Miss Marvel, you end up in a huge, huge hole because they're just gonna be better than you, and you're playing all this tech that does nothing. That said, I do think this is sort of the default list. It has a lot of answers for a lot of different things in the metagame. You draw your Zabu a little bit more, thanks to America Chavez, but I don't know if this is necessarily the list I would recommend. This is a deck that requires you tuning it to beat the stuff that you see. You have to take the core of the deck and build outward from there. And there are very few sacred cows, so to speak, here. There are very few cards that are like absolutely uncuttable. I mean, there are a couple, but like there are not as many as you think. So let's take a look at the Blaster Dark tournament winning deck list in the context of the previous conversation. Now, I will say that I think this list is a very powerful one because it has just abandoned any pretense of being a tech list. And what that does is give you a huge advantage in mirrors because of the card Mystique. Mystique is an incredibly powerful card in a world where nobody is playing Rogue and nobody is playing Enchantress. And because of that, Mystique is a force multiplier in this list that other builds simply do not have access to. Even something as simple as Devil Dinosaur into Mystique Agent Coulson, or, Zabu into Darkhawk Mystique on the final turn of the game. These are plays that other decks in this type of build will not be able to replicate. I'm not saying this is 100% the best build of it. I don't think it is, but it is an example of just how much variation there can be between the builds of Darkhawk. Finally, on this island, we arrive at what I consider the happy medium. This is my favorite Darkhawk list in the entire game right now for the way that it uses Doctor Doom, Invisible Woman, and, of course, Absorbing Man. Now, the Absorbing Man might look a little weird to you, but playing Absorbing Man inside the Invisible Woman and then Doctor Doom on the final turn of the game means that Absorbing Man will copy that Doctor Doom. This is very, very powerful, obviously. The same goes for Mystique. Putting a Mystique in the Invisible Woman and then playing for something like a Darkhawk as your last card gives you a lot of power. This is a very unique way of doing it. The first time I saw someone doing this in Darkhawk, it was actually Equinox, and I'm glad that it just sort of percolated outward from there. And for me, I think this is the deck that I like the most in the context of the Darkhawk deck as a whole. I think it's a very good balance. If I could identify one weak point in it, it is that your turn 3 is pretty awkward if you don't have your turn 2s or, of course, Rock Slide, right? So there are going to be some games where you just absolutely clunk, and you do need to know that. However, most of what I like about this deck is that it uses a lot of the strongest cards in the game, and I really like the inclusion of Shadow King if you're not going to play Shang-Chi. I think this has the right balance of tech, the right balance of surprise cards, and the right balance of power to make it my favorite Darkhawk list right now. Moving on to the small island number 3, this is Destroy. You probably are familiar with it, but for those who are not, this is a deck based around destroying your Deadpool as much as possible and creating a very large Null or a very large Taskmaster. Yes, Taskmaster remains in my list. I find it to be a useful tool in many games where I am wanting to throw priority and I don't have access to X23's extra energy. Now, some of the time, that's just going to be what you have to do, is just be like, all right, I'm going to play Deadpool Taskmaster on the final turn of the game. Not a lot of people are playing Cosmo. Far more people are playing things like Shadow King, things like Shang-Chi, and those are the things that your main issues are going to come from. You need to be really worried about that kind of stuff. You also need to respect Loki's into you, unfortunately, because if they get things like Null, it's very, very, very bad for you. And of course, this is a deck that does get hurt by the increase in Shadow King and Shang-Chi. Shadow King, of course, takes your Venoms down to size. Shang-Chi will blow up your Deaths, significantly large Venoms. And while Null can give you value back on that, it's still pretty bad if it happens to you. One note here is Taskmaster is just not something you run out there. You don't run Taskmaster out there if you think they might have a Shadow King, because yes, he will go down to 0 power. This is part of why I like him as a method of throwing priority so that their tech cards don't work on you alongside a gigantic Deadpool. Yes, this deck is predictable. Yes, this deck is easy to understand and relatively easy to beat. However, it is just so damn strong when it works. It is just extremely powerful, and it is a deck that rewards you for it is a deck that rewards you for correctly assessing early game situations and understanding how they snowball for you later. You will be getting a lot out of early snaps with a deck like this because you have the knowledge of, say, all right, I'm going to do something like, forge a Deadpool and then blow up the Deadpool and then Nico it to draw 2. Just some really messed up stuff. And you know that you have to do that. And I think you are sort of priced into snapping in a lot of those situations because that's what the deck's nut draw is. And this deck's nut draw, yeah, it's beatable, but it's not likely to be beaten. And I think that's the biggest advantage that this deck has, is that you get to play legitimately pretty aggressively and get rewarded for it. This is my preferred build of Lockdown, although I will say there is a decent amount of variation in Lockdown builds right now. That said, this is like island number 4, I would say is probably the smallest. I'm a lot more high on Destroy than I am on Lockdown. I just think that it is impossible to talk about this metagame without talking about, Storm, Professor X, Eliath. These are good cards, and this is a good deck. I do think it is probably my 4th choice behind, either of the decks that we've talked about previously. I'd rather play Loki, I'd rather play Bounce, I'd rather play Darkhawk, Ms. Marvel, I'd rather play Destroy. But hey, it's not that bad. It's not that bad really to be behind those decks in my estimation. It's a very, very powerful strategy. It tends to be a little bit linear. It tends to be actually quite good against the werewolf stuff, but it does sort of fall apart in the face of the especially aggressive Darkhawk decks. You do not want to see them playing Miss Marvel Doctor Doom if part of your plan is doing that yourself and you're the one investing in locking down lanes, right? If you're doing the same power plays, but you're playing a Professor X and a Storm, and they're playing an Iron Lad and a Darkhawk, you feel pretty stupid. And that's the main issue that I have with this archetype as it is right now. So now that we've talked about the decks that I would legitimately recommend, I do think I want to highlight some of the underplayed lists that are out there that are succeeding at a decently high level. And by decently high, I mean these lists are doing very well in the top 50. This is, of course, Jet's list of Phoenix Force. I get it. It looks very weird. That said, he is currently top 5 in the world with this list, so there's clearly something there. In addition, Phoenix Force is looking to get a buff, or at least a bug fix, in the near future. Now, this is not how I would build Phoenix Force. It is a newer build of the list that is sort of more focused on Doctor Strange and more focused specifically on the nut draw with multiple man as opposed to Human Torch. Now, why are we abandoning Human Torch? Again, I think that comes down to the increase in Shadow King, the increase in Shang-Chi, and of course, the relative increase in Killmonger. These cards are kind of everywhere, and dodging them is very hard to do. Whereas with the multiple man plan, that is a much more consistently powerful way to play the game of Marvel Snap. Yes, you still get hurt a little bit by Shadow King, but you're still getting effectively power for free on all of the locations that you move your little Phoenix Force to. So this deck plays for the nut draw. It does not bother with the plans that get obliterated by basically every basically every tech card in the entire game. And the Deadpool stuff serves as a, like, okay, so we didn't have our nut draw here, but we might have a giant Deadpool. We might be able to do giant Deadpool into giant Taskmaster. Maybe that'll work. And of course, Chavez glues it all together. So while other Phoenix Force lists tend to be just all in on, I'm going to do the Phoenix Force thing, you have your all in Phoenix Force thing. You're not losing anything from that, but you're not playing the bad end of your all-in Phoenix Force. There are games where if you have a Human Torch, you go all in on the Human Torch, you get completely obliterated, and you cry yourself to sleep. And those games are good to remove from your grouping of games because you have to snap in them a lot of the time, and it's really frustrating to have a very easily answerable Phoenix Force that gets immediately blown up after you've snapped. It's very, very tough to deal with. It's a low cube equity game plan right now, and for that reason, I think it's a pretty solid cut here. Now, this deck does require being tricky, right? You have multiple ways of moving your cards around, and that is something that you're gonna have to do. You're gonna have to pick 2 lanes and focus on them and do what you can when you're not comboing off. And of course, remember, you are a combo deck. When you have your combo, be aggressive with it. Hit them with that snap on your turn 2 when you have the stuff that does the broken thing. Like, don't be afraid of doing that, especially when it's multiple man, because that's the one that's just very difficult for many decks to answer. Next up in this category, we have Woody Surfer, which is a totally fine and functional deck for those of you who are looking for something a little bit different. I will say, I think this deck scales pretty heavily with play skill. It's a very dangerous deck to pick up and pilot in inexperienced hands, but it is, I think, one of the most interesting decks that I've played. I had a lot of success with it personally, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be true for everyone who picks it up. I like it. It is a good deck that I think, like most other sort of mid-rangey style decks trying to match up into Loki, is carried by being a little bit awkward when it gets Loki'd, and of course the card Shadow King. And I think that is just generally enough for it to be good. Also, I think this is a shell I'd like to investigate future cards Sebastian Shaw in, and that means that it might be worth familiarizing yourself with now, because I do consider this a legitimately good deck, albeit a little underplayed. All right, y'all, that's going to be it for me. I hope you enjoyed this different focus of the rundown here. I sort of see the metagame as split up into those 4 camps. We have, of course, the Bounce shells. We have the Miss Marvel Darkhawk shells, and then we have, you know, a little smaller, we got Destroy, and we got Lockdown. And then there's everything orbiting around those poles, as it were. So that is how I see the metagame right now. Of course, you can find all the lists in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I have been KMBest. I will see you in the next one.